Okay, this video previews week 3 of the 5-day Bible reading program. That plan is linked in the description below. Week 3 in the New Testament takes us from Mark 11 to Mark 15. But since we just have that one chapter dangling, then we'll go ahead and talk about the rest of the book of Mark this week. Okay, we've said before that the book of Mark can be thought about in two sections. Everything leading up to chapter 8, where Peter makes his confession that Jesus is the Christ, and then everything following chapter 8, culminating in Jesus' death and resurrection. We could also think about the book of Mark as a series of 3 acts. The first act getting us to chapter 8 and that confession, and then a second act in chapters 8, 9, and 10, where Jesus is trying to prepare his disciples for his suffering, death, and resurrection that is to come. And then the third and final act in chapters 11 to the end, where all of that takes place in a pretty short amount of time, in about 7 days. And that is what we're going to be reading about this week. There are in this final week 3 main players. Jesus, of course, and one of the players is the Jewish leadership. And that conflict between Jesus and the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem is really what drives this story. In some ways, it is rooted in what happens in chapter 11. He goes into the temple and he drives out the people that are changing money, selling animals for sacrifice, and he accuses those people there of turning the Lord's house, which is supposed to be a house of prayer for all people, and they have used it to take advantage of the poor and needy, and yet claim that because they are God's people, they are immune from his judgment. And that obviously makes the Jewish leaders very upset. And so in the rest of chapter 11 and chapter 12, there will be a conflict of arguments, and he continues to show them with his answers, with a parable, and with his direct rebuke that they are in the wrong, that they are hypocritical, and that they will be judged for that. Well, that seems to be precisely what chapter 13 is referring to. I think primarily Mark chapter 13 is a prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem that will come upon the city in 70 AD, which in many ways is a sign of God's judgment against them for their rejection of Jesus. In chapters 14 and 15, all of this culminates with Jesus being arrested, with Jesus being put on trial, and with Jesus being crucified by the authority of Pontius Pilate. And in all of this, we continue to see the hypocrisy of the Jews. And they show themselves in the end to be hard-hearted, to the point of putting not only an innocent man on the cross, but putting the Christ to death in humiliating fashion. But the other player in all of this are the disciples of Jesus. And what we see with the disciples is their weakness. It is Peter in these final chapters that represents the faithlessness of the disciples when Jesus needs them most. He claims that he will be loyal to Jesus to the end. And Jesus says, "No, Peter, you will deny me." And that's exactly what happens. But even before then, when they are in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see Peter and the other disciples sleeping when Jesus has asked them to keep watch for him and to pray. Judas, of course, the most tragic example of the disciples' weakness, who for his greed hands Jesus over to the authorities to be arrested, put on trial, and killed. And so, when Jesus faces this final moment and goes to the cross, he does so largely alone, rejected by his own people, forsaken by those who followed him closely. But as he hangs on the cross, we have another declaration of who Jesus is. This time not from a disciple, not from someone close to him, but from a centurion, from a Gentile, from the Roman soldier at the foot of the cross who sees all of this going on. He sees the way Jesus dies, and he says, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." But again, we come back to this idea that Mark is telling this story so that his readers will think about themselves, to see themselves in the story. And so, who will we be in this final act of the story? Will we be like those scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees and chief priests, that find any way we can to refuse God's teaching, to do what we want to do, to seek after our own will and harden our heart against the very things we know that God is calling us to do in the Word? Or will we be like the disciples who let the weaknesses of our flesh get in the way, who shrink back from the difficult moment, from the moments that we are called on to stand up with Jesus? Or will we imitate Jesus and go with him to the cross, as he said back in chapter 8, to take up our cross and to go, to suffer, to be willing to give everything, just as he has given everything for us. But of course, Jesus giving everything is not the end of the story. In chapter 16 will tell us that on the third day they will find the tomb empty, and they will be charged to go and tell that Jesus has been raised. And yet, even in that moment, their weakness lingers, and they are afraid. But that fear presents them and presents us with a decision to make. Will we allow our fear to get in the way, or will we overcome that fear by putting our faith and trust in Jesus and go and tell that news to the world? Mark has told us this story to proclaim that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. And as the story ends, he wants us to ask ourselves, what are we going to do about that?